Hey, it's me, Robert Bomander, your guide to the world of big ears and the birders who are crazy enough to do them. I'm out on my deck in Brantford, Ontario, and today is May 1st, 2023, and it is the official start of migration season here in southern Ontario. You know, birders from far and wide, some doing their own big ears, I'm sure, are migrating here to Canada's spring birding hotspot, Point Pelee National Park, to welcome the songbirds home. Now, down in Ohio, many birders will be making their way to the biggest week in American birding. Sue and I, unfortunately, had to cancel our last trip there as the COVID pandemic and lockdowns were just beginning to be felt in the spring of 2020. Down in Texas, the winged migration begins a little earlier, and in fact, my guest Laura Keene just saw her first golden-cheeked warbler of the year, a beautiful songbird that sadly will likely never make its way up north. In 2016, inspired by a close friend, Laura began her own journey across North America, doing a photographic big year, recording a record-breaking 763 species in the continental U.S., and adding more birds in Hawaii to finish with 815 species, the vast majority of which she was able to photograph, an achievement in itself, as many of us birder photographers know. Laura's story of doing a big year is as inspiring as it is exciting, and I was lucky enough to spend an hour on the phone with her via FaceTime recently, and, well, let's let her begin the story.
Down in
Where,
Texas, it's a
where,
pretty warm day and lots of butterflies and golden-cheeked warblers around, so life is
wow,
good here.
really glad to have you come on my fledgling podcast. Very much appreciate it. And Eve Morel said, if you're going to talk to me, you better be talking to Laura Keene as well. I asked Laura, have for at least a couple of years had the record for the ABA area for a woman. And I'd love to learn a little bit about that. And I'd love to learn a bit about your whole birding adventure. Maybe let's start with how you ended up getting into birding in the first place.
I took field biology in high school, and I was lucky enough to have a biology teacher who was into birding, and we would go on canoe trips, and he would point out cliff swallows and kingfishers, but along the way I saw an indigo bunting, which just was my spark bird. So with babysitting money, I bought my first Peterson's field guide back in the 70s, and so I was hooked on birding from that point. But once I went to college, I did a few field trips with the biology department, but then I went to pharmacy school and got extremely busy. And with that career and family and children, I mostly birded on vacation and in my backyard.
Which seems to be the story of a lot of birders in their journey into birding. Mine was a very different journey. I was not a birder in 2011 and went to the movie The Big Year and literally changed my life in 2 hours. And I read the book and decided around November 25th or so that I was going to try that in 2012. And
Wow.
so that was my journey into birding, and I've never quit. And so that's where you started as a youngster, but as you found yourself with more time, how did that evolve into a big year? And also how did you get the inspiration for it and also the education to be able to do a big year? Because I know it takes more than just, "Oh, I think I'll do a big year," like I did.
I lived in Ohio. I think sometime in the 90s, my best friend said, let's take some photography classes. So we took classes at a community college. And she said, there's this really magical place that I've heard of up on Lake Erie called McGee Marsh.
Oh, yes.
So this is while we both had families. And so we said, let's just take a trip up there. We had no clue
What it was going to be?
what it was going to be. So it was like a 1 day trip it was about 3 hours each way. The next year it was 2 days. The next year it was 3 days. And so this was our Mother's Day weekend. That was our Mother's Day gift from our families. We would go to McGee Marsh. And as I like to say, as our kids started fledging the nest, our trips got longer and we just got really totally hooked on warblers. And I was involved with the Ohio Ornithological Society. I was the photo editor for the Ohio Cardinal. But mostly I was a very busy pharmacist. And so I had a weird schedule, worked a lot of nights on call. And so I was out birding at times that nobody else was. But being a photographer, that's okay. But I just kind of learned on my own a lot. I picked up a lot on my own, and it's a lot easier if you have someone, that's more knowledgeable to be birding with. And I would occasionally get together with Cincinnati Bird Club and always found that great. But it was just never easy with my schedule. But so I'd say the reason why I got into the big year was, you talk about it, you think about it. I read Ken Kaufman's book. I saw the Big Year movie, and I'd done like an Ohio big year. I wanted to like photograph so many species, and I did vacation big year, and I got 500 birds photographed in my vacation big year. But it was always kind of in the back of your head, you'd love to do that, but there's absolutely no way you could ever do something so crazy. But my best friend that I was talking about, a neighbor, she 2014, we were at McGee Marsh, and she wasn't feeling well. And it turned out by the time we got home, she was basically admitted to the hospital the next day with leukemia. I'd say we went through I'd say she went through all of the chemo, and going through that with your best friend, it makes you look at life differently. And sorry, I didn't mean to be
No, I
sounding.
can understand that. I believe me.
But yeah, so I think you start looking at life and the experiences differently. So it was a year-long journey for her. She lost her battle in 2015, and it was a learning experience, and I am grateful because I feel like living that through her, and all the talking that we did and encouragement from her. She said, "You got to do a big year." She kept encouraging me,
Oh,
because
wow.
she says there's things that I want to do. I wish I'd taken more pictures of wood ducks, and just little things like that. But she's like, "You got to do a big year." And she just kept saying this to me. And it's after she was gone, it was like, my kids are all out of college. Work was becoming a kind of, it felt like an existence instead of, and that was the impetus. And I said to my husband, I said, "I'm thinking about doing this." And he was working a lot out of town, and he was very busy. And so it really, time wise, it was just like the perfect time to do it in 2016 for me. I think I was still working part-time. I was still working my job. I would come back and work these long weekends, 3 weeks or so, and just to keep my foot in the door with work. And I already had a vacation that was a birding trip scheduled with friends to Mexico in February. So I already had a lot of my days that I could have been devoting toward my big year kind of used up with working and stuff. I look at those days that I was working, and I would look at it and say, "Gee, I could have done better had I not gone to Mexico," but I only missed one bird. So I can't really say that.
And you set a pretty amazing record too. More important, and a lot of birders who are doing big years,
Right.
they do
Yeah.
not make time for their families. And I
Yeah.
I can say I was guilty of that in 2012. I jumped into it, and I really didn't even tell people ahead of time that is what I was going to do. My wife was like, "You're going again? You're going again? You have to go there. You have to go there." I have to go to Arizona. Did you have any situations like that where you felt like, "Oh, I could have been better or nicer to my family or friends"?
My goal at the beginning of the year was to make sure that I was with my grandchildren, all three of my grandchildren, on their birthdays. They would remember that. My husband, he was traveling a lot already. And after going through losing my best friend and losing, in the few years before that, I lost both of my parents. I think he said he was very encouraging. And at some point, like a couple of months into it, I paid for the At2 trip up front, and I paid for a photographic, like a trip to Nome up front. And then I think by March, I think I could run out of money by the time I hit a certain. And I said to my husband, I said, "I'm just going to," and he's an engineer. He kept spreadsheets of looking at these spreadsheets. And I said, I'm going to have to stop birding in August. Basically, I'm not going to get to go to Alaska because I knew that the amount of money I had set aside wasn't going to last the whole year. And he said, "This is the happiest I've seen you in so long, and I'll do anything I can to make it possible for you to continue." And I have to say, by the end of the year, my friends were calling him Saint Dave. Never complained once. You realize what a special person that you're married to, but total support from him and my family, my kids and my grandkids even were making me sending me notes, and it was just really sweet. So I think that being in a relationship, it's a 50-50 thing, and you have to give when they need it and they have to give when you need it. And he obviously saw that was something that I needed.
That is a wonderful story. It's something we all have to be very aware of, that our friends and family are the ones that are making it possible for us to continue, and
Right.
not making us feel down about the fact that we're having a fun adventure.
Right. I said, we would drop each other off at the airport and pick each other up. You pull up. And at some point, about halfway through the year, when I would come back home, he would park the car and come in to greet me I just thought that was so special that because traveling was just something that we did, drop off, pick up, drop off. It's like, made me feel important that he would be standing there waiting for me to give me a hug when I got back from each trip, which was, I thought, just such a supportive thing for him to do.
That is wonderful. So, leading up to January 1st, obviously you had to do preparations. And I know you mentioned spreadsheets. There are a lot of birders who do immense preparation for their big years, and there are other ones that just sometime in May realize that they've seen 500 species and just start a big year then. What was the preparation like for you?
I was trying to prioritize the birds that, like the owls, the months that you can get owls, like seeing grouse. You have to schedule the owls for February, Sax-Zimbalg, and the grouse in like March and April. So you have a little list of things that you can see during these months the best. And then you've got obviously the gulls and things that are easier to see in the wintertime. So you got a prioritized list. There's some things you can see year round. I was in this more for the journey than I was to go and see every single bird. Plus, I was doing a photographic big year. So for me, I had to take a picture of everything. And that's what I love about birding is just taking pictures and slowing down and enjoying things. So I wanted to see birds every month. I wasn't in a big hurry to see birds that I knew I could see in December. So I wanted to have something to look forward to. I didn't want to have all these birds and then 3 months of sitting around waiting for something to show up.
A lot of big year birders tend to want to get that really high number by the end of May so that they just stay on top the whole year. And in your case, you thought, I'm going to see the birds anyway. Why do I have to have this big list early in the year if I'm going to see something in December?
So I knew which birds I could see year round. I focused on, here's the places now starting in January. There's this many rare birds, and where do I go first? And I'm going to try and then travel to the place that has the most rare birds for the best bang for the buck, basically.
Yes.
And I started off traveling with my husband to Vancouver to see a redwing, and we had a little trip. We went there at the beginning of the year, and then the cheapest place to go is Texas, and there were 4 rarities in Texas right then. So I went the cheapest ticket, so I went to Texas, and I kind of just followed that path. And it was such a crazy year that I kept chasing. It seemed like I was just constantly chasing a rare bird.
I did a Canada big year last year, and that was my January and February, just going back and forth across the country. And I was doing trips from Newfoundland to Vancouver and back to Nova Scotia and to Alberta. And the first 2 months were just crazy. But sometimes you think it's only one bird, but all those one birds really add up if you chase the rare ones early in the year.
Yeah, yeah.
What were some of the other rare ones that were in Texas that you were chasing?
Like my nemesis that year was the Golden-cheeked Warbler, which I'd seen before. And it was in this park in Texas, in Refugio, Texas, that I would go there and it would be seen, and then it just seems like it wouldn't be around for several days. I tried more times than I can even count to see that Golden-cheeked Warbler.
I assume you did spring migration in late April.
Yeah, and it seemed like I said, Zaxton Bog was it was a year where there were no owls
Mm.
in Zaxton Bog. Then when it came to spring migration in Texas, the day that I was supposed to go there, there was massive flooding, and you couldn't even get out to where the
Boy Scout woods and all that.
that was all like underwater. It seemed like you just had to play it by ear. So instead, I went up to Oregon and Washington to see owls, and then came back and instead of hitting those areas in Texas, I went along the coast and along near Corpus, the area along there, and I actually got a lot of birds there. So it was my first experience ever doing springtime birding in Texas because I lived in Ohio, and every single spring I was in McGee Marsh. It was a great experience to bird in a different place in the spring. So
We've done obviously McGee Marsh in the spring, but I did a summer trip to McGee Marsh once, and very different experience when you're the only one on the boardwalk. But I still saw a really nice selection of birds that day and felt I had the entire marsh to myself, which is a
yep,
neat feeling. I did the same thing with the Zaxton Bog by going in the summer. And I thought I was the only one crazy enough to do that. But I've talked to a couple other birders who also went there in the summer because they wanted to see it in a very different light than you do during the depths of winter.
yeah, and you probably went to Pelee
Point Pelee,
for
we do Point Pelee every year.
yeah,
The biggest fallout I ever had in spring migration in Canada was at Rondeau, not at Point Pelee. And they all talk about the fallouts at Point Pelee, but my Rondeau one was fun because I think we stopped counting Canada warblers at 25. And that's just something that you
yeah,
you don't experience other than a fallout, and you're also stepping over birds that
yeah.
are just on the ground. What's your best fallout experience?
I'd say probably at McGee, there was probably a couple of days when I had over more than 25 species of warbler. Just those real amazing days where the weather was such that they would be starting to fly out over the lake and then come back. And they come in different waves there, the early migrants in the middle and then the late migrants. But then you'd get the females from the early migration and just had a whole lot of birds. And it was just had a few years like that were just so fantastic some days.
So
Yeah.
you said, as you said, you prepaid for Atu, and every birder who does a big year, the full ABA big year, has to do Atu. And
Right.
was this before or after they stopped landing on the island?
Yeah, this was after. So we were able to go with John Pushak. He had a trip every year, and it was by boat. You would fly into Adak and
Mm.
then take the boat out from Adak out to Attu, which would give you the opportunity to see the pelagic species,
Mm.
whiskered auklets, and we saw the short-tailed albatross, which was obviously something that these birds that are in your dreams that you'll never ever see. I made myself quite seasick taking pictures of the short-tailed albatross.
So you get to Atu on the boat, and do you do like day trips on a Zodiac?
Yeah, so you're basically in a kind of a protected harbor. The
Mm.
boat is, and you go out on the Zodiac to shore, and it was always 10 to 15 miles, maybe even more than that. We had bicycles that,
I heard the stories of the
yeah,
bicycles, and
yeah,
I'm thinking I can barely ride 20 miles on flat ground, and I hear the stories of some of these chases to different spots on the island where you have to bike 15 miles to get there. How was that?
it was rather level. These are paths that are clear still, and even like the runway, it's there's not a lot of up and
Oh,
downhill
that's good.
involved. That I did go because I hadn't ridden a bike in ages, so I did go out and go bike riding with my friend just to see if I could do 10 miles to survive it. And it was on a bike along a river. So it's okay, I can do this. I wouldn't say it was easy all the time, but but we did the first day probably by foot. And then we were supposed to be there, I think, like 12 days. And the boat ended up having issues. So we were stuck in Adak the first 2 days. And so we didn't have a place to really stay there. Adak doesn't have a lot of lodging or
Mhm.
cars, but they were able to find some places. So we stayed in two different places, had to switch between the two, and had a vehicle that we needed to put water in about every hour because but we birded there, and we had a pair of SMUs, so it wasn't all that bad. But the boat finally made it in, and then I think we were on the island for 4 days, and the captain got word that there was a big storm coming in that was going to be hitting from the direction of that was the boat was sheltered, but it was going to be coming from that direction. And he said, we got to leave. And so you're thinking 4 days here.
So that's not nearly
That's it.
enough.
We took off out of there and stayed at Agatu Island in a protected harbor there that was protected from the winds.
So did the change of scenery benefit your trip, or do you feel like you missed out because of that? Seems like storms bring in the good stuff.
So we went back, and when we had to go just by foot because they didn't have time to land the bikes. So it was the next couple of days were probably 10 to 15 miles. We walked every day, but it was the last day there. We got the mix of rarities that we were there for. We were having these shorebirds come in, and talking like, oh, we had the Ateric sandpiper and lots of different
Tailed snipe, things like that.
Yeah, someone else got the pin-tailed snipe, gray-tailed and wandering tattlers and eye-browed thrush. And, so we had some good birds come in there that last day. But the hard part was leaving, knowing that there's probably more smaller birds on their way. If we could be there for 1 or 2 more days, we could probably see more. So it was hard to leave. But
Sandy Camito told me that he stayed there for 4 weeks.
And then when we got back to Adak, there was a far eastern curlew that happened to be there. So we were able to get vehicles to jump in the car and go see that before our flight.
That's a pretty nifty last bird, isn't it?
That was a pretty good last bird. It was, all in all, it was a wonderful trip. It was just going to the place that you've heard so much about. Some of my friends had visited there and told me stories about it. And so it was just a beautiful trip, and I wouldn't change that for anything.
I'm hoping to sometime in the next few years be able to schedule that on for one of my birding trips. My only experience with what Attu might be like is from a few old pictures and from the movie. How well did they depict life on Attu in the movie?
I'd say the buildings have had a lot of tear since I think it was in the 2008 was the last year that they were there. There's a lot of wear and tear on the buildings, but you can still see the walls where people signed their name and the number of birds that they had. And every year they put the number of birds. So we were able to put our names and the number of birds we had on the wall inside the building. We kept our bikes there by the building where they stayed. But I'd say, look, the runway looked exactly like it was depicted. It was so well depicted in the movie.
What I did as part of my Canada Big Year, one of my goals was to visit every site that in British Columbia that they shot scenes for the Big Year. And so I got up to the Yukon and the Dempster Highway and traveled to some of the places where they set up for their version of Attu. And I actually stood in the spot where there's a bird that they all raced out of the cabin to get, rustic bunting. And I stood at the exact place overlooking where Jack Black slipped on the ice. Which is for me is a funny story because that was not in the script. And yet Sandy Camito tells a story about the fact that Greg Miller on the Anchorage trip just before they got to Attu slipped on the ice in the exact same way. And you're up in the Yukon. I don't know if you've been up there. There's nothing there, and there's no cell phone signals, and there's nobody to help you if something goes wrong. And that's right. It would be when you're on the island.
Yeah, it's the most remote. I've never been on a boat that long and never seen another boat the entire time. Just that remote from everyone. It's just you have to be very careful. You don't want to hurt yourself while you're there.
And I guess you're very careful on some of the terrain when you're hiking to make sure you don't twist that ankle.
And the terrain there could be very difficult. There's a lot of nesting geese there. Everything's rock. There's a lot of rocks and a lot of geese. There's a lot of things to slip on.
And what was the rarest bird on Attu that you saw that year? Was there one that was like a new bird for the island?
No, nothing super rare. I was really lucky to, I happened to be kind of lagging behind a bit, and I went to get things on my bicycle, and I turned around, and there was a Eurasian hobby sitting probably no more than 20 feet from me looking at me. And that was probably the most exciting bird for me on the trip, just because I saw it, and there was one other person that I was with, and we radioed the others to come. They had already taken off on their bikes to go back to get on the boat, and they turned around and came back, but it flew, and it flew like we were just below the runway, and it flew up and over the runway and never to be seen again. But we got pictures of it, so that was just a cool experience
Well,
with that.
see, sometimes like the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise wins the rare
Exactly.
bird. That's cool. It's always fun when
Yeah.
you're the first one to find something and you can let
Yeah.
other people know that it's there. So from Attu, what was next, and how many birds, by the way, did you leave Attu and Alaska with that at that point?
Oh gosh. I think that I had about 75 species on that trip, but definitely it was more the experience that I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's like you're doing a big year and the number of birds is important, but it was more like a big year of experiences, doing
Mm-hmm.
things you've always wanted to do and just doing it and enjoying it.
And
Right.
have you felt like you've had a little bit of influence on people in pushing them to do, if not a big year, travel that they never would have expected to do?
Yeah, I've done my big year presentation multiple times. People keep asking me to do it, so it's I'm doing it for the Texas Ornithological Society in May, and I
Mm-hmm.
did it last month for a Laredo birding festival. It's fun to share, and like I said, I did a photographic big year, so that was my goal to photograph as many species as I could, and I think it's a good way to do a big year is to record it for you, for everybody else, and it makes the presentations a little more interesting if you have pictures too, I think.
I was a photographer before a birder, and I know what it's like to not get that picture you really wanted. What I actually, as a side note, I found that birders that I've met that have birded for 10, 20 years and decide to get a camera and start photographing the birds, they find that it's almost very frustrating because they didn't realize that you can't see birds through your camera the way you see them through your binoculars. And
Right.
what bird was the one that you had hoped to get a really good picture of that you couldn't?
I'd say the Eurasian hobby was the one because I had just stuck my camera inside my bag and strapped it onto my bike, turned around, and I've got this Eurasian hobby right in front of me with no camera, and I'm looking at it through my bins, and fortunately the other guy had stuck his in his backpack, and he was able to pull it out and snap pictures, so those weren't even my pictures. So that's one that I'm getting pictures of. Like I saw 815 species and I photographed 792, and that's one I missed.
Thankfully, you had the person with you.
Yep.
When I was on a pelagic with Eve Morel in 2016,
Hmm.
and we came across the blue-footed booby, and I knew where it was, and it just didn't show up in any of my pictures that
Yeah.
I took. And luckily, Eve took a couple of
Yeah.
pictures of it, and she was able to share the
Yeah.
blue-footed booby picture with me because that's the only picture of that bird I have. So, when did you go to Hawaii? Because that was the first year that Hawaii was
Right.
on the ABA list, or it was, I'm not sure what I've heard now, but the
Right. So
ABA was like, we're putting it on the list, and people went to Hawaii in 2016, but they didn't technically accept it until
right.
2017.
Yeah, they had said initially that, and I think they were trying to be nice and say it's not going to count for big year birders in 2016 because it was voted on in October at the annual meeting in October, and or at the end of October, beginning of November. It would have basically been, I guess they looked at it like you're only going to have, unless you've already gone, which why would you go when you're doing a big year?
Yes.
You're only going to have 2 months to see these birds. And so I think they were trying to be nice and say it's only going to count after they actually get the list because they didn't even have a list of
Oh,
birds
I
yet.
see.
Decided upon which of the birds in Hawaii were going to be on the ABA list. But then we did petition it after the fact, we decided to go. I know Olaf was the first one to go in November. Then I ran into John Weigel, and so John said, I'm thinking about going to Hawaii at the beginning of December. So if you want to go, we can team up on it." So I actually ended up going up to flying up to Gamble to see a pine bunting, and then I went to Nome to get the McKay's bunting, and then they had the Cyber Monday sale for tickets from Anchorage to Honolulu for
Wow.
$99.
Can't pass that up.
So I met John down there and Jared Clark, who was a guide in Newfoundland, and
Oh, I know Jared.
Jared, yeah.
I
And
saw the
so
Red Wing with him last year.
yeah. And so John had met up with Jared earlier in the year. I hadn't met Jared before, but he had gotten Jared to come down and guide us. I'd been to Hawaii before, and I had birded only on Maui, and Jared was a huge help. And basically every single bird that we targeted, we got. It was amazing. We just did 3 islands with Jared, thinking that is 6 days, and thinking got to get back to the get back to the mainland because we got birds to get back there, but really nothing showed up in those 6 days that was something that we needed. So it worked out fine. And then Jared left, and so John and I then went to Kauai and birded there. So it was really an amazing trip. So then we made an appeal to the ABA, and on the second vote, then they decided to make it countable for us too, because it would have just been an asterisk, but it would probably still been accepted as it's the highest number.
I see that they still like to publish the Continental and the Continental plus Hawaii. I think
Yeah.
the argument was for years that if you can count birds on Attu, why can't you count them in Hawaii?
But yeah, so now it's like the ABA is everything, including Hawaii, and then you got the Continental, and yeah, which is the old ABA basically. Realistically, we knew that there's a lot of birds that nest the shearwaters, and you can see them. The petrels, they nest like right there along some of the paths even.
Mhm.
So we knew that they were going to all be out to sea, and so we knew that our number wasn't going to be as high as it could be because we had earlier in the year. But it was like still we made a good attempt there in Hawaii, but we still dipped on a lot of things that would be so easy had we gone just a few months earlier.
And I guess birders who have done the big years since 2016 are targeting Hawaii at a different time.
And like John decided to do a second big year in 2019 just because he felt like he could do better in Hawaii, and focused on. He did get more species. I'm not sure. Maybe he ended up with 839. Maybe.
Yeah, I think he got more species in total, but his continental list wasn't as high as it was the previous year. That might be because of going for big numbers and doing Hawaii at a certain time.
And so many of the numbers are just. It just depends on how good of a year you have. Like in Alaska, I went to Gamble in the fall, and I sat there for 17 days and didn't see a single new bird because the winds were all coming from the east. So the rare birds there were like golden crown kinglets.
That's funny because when I went to New Brunswick for the Stellar Sea Eagle in November, did you chase that bird?
The Stellar Sea, I chased it twice. Of course, I live in Texas, and it was
right there.
It was on the area that it was here was all private property. So it was like private access to. So people tried like the next day, and I don't think that I would have had a chance to do it because nobody saw it down here after it was first seen. So when it was up in Boston, I met up with Evie, and we tried for it, got there a day late. and then it was up in Maine. So then I went up there last year, and I think in January, and saw it in Maine. So I finally did see it.
I've met a lot of people that have chased that bird all over the place. I started looking for it in July of 2021. I went up to Quebec to look for it and didn't see it, missed it by a day. And then during my Canada big year, I missed it in Nova Scotia, then in Newfoundland, then in Nova Scotia again, and had no hope that bird was ever going to show up again before the end of the year. And then late in November, I was in Quebec, and all of a sudden my emails and my texts are all lighting up. that the seagull was in New Brunswick, and I'm like, okay, where am I? How far is it? And I look at my map on the phone, and I see, oh, it's only 7 hours away, driving through blizzards and darkness and roads with no lights. And I got there the next morning, and then didn't appear again until like 4 in the afternoon, and finally we got to see it. So that was, for me, that was one of the most exciting birds of the year.
Oh,
Within the, I guess, the continental US, what was one of the chases that felt like that to you?
I started out the year in Canada, ended the year in Canada. There was a common shelduck, I believe. There was a pair of common shelduck,
Yes,
and so it was really fun. I like I told you, I was waiting till end of the year to see certain species, and I ended up still meeting a couple of birds on the East Coast. So my last trip was to see. I think it was as simple as purple sandpiper. I needed
mm-hmm.
purple sandpiper, and then the common shelduck showed up, and so then I had just a fun drive up to see the common shelduck with three of my friends, one being Neil Hayward and another person who held the lower 48 big year record, Chris Hitt, and another friend and bird filmer. And it was just like a fun trip with friends to end the, and that was probably one of the trips that I just look back on being just a super fun trip, which was much better than earlier in the year when I took a trip to the wild goose chase trip that you always have to do.
Yes.
And this was January, and so I picked up a friend in Columbus, and we drove up there, and I got the pink-footed goose, and I think the
Barnacle goose.
The barnacle goose was stopped being seen where it was, so we took a detour, and there was a winter storm approaching, and so we managed to get it in New Jersey, and then we took off driving and got stuck on the Pennsylvania Turnpike for 7 or 8 hours behind an accident. So you're just dead stopped. But like I said, we're birders, and so we had warm clothing, we had food, we had a cooler, we had plenty of. So we just sat there. But I was trying to get back to Ohio to see a kelp gull.
Ooh, that's a really good bird. To me, is that like the rarest gull that you can see in North America, or one of them?
Probably one of the rarest. Yeah. I saw a white-footed gull, but I saw that on the East Coast of Coney Island. But yes, one of the harder ones to find, that's for sure.
And there were also times in my experience where I was in the middle of nowhere, and I felt like I was in a position where I wasn't necessarily afraid, but was very worried about my safety. And there's certainly times in Texas. Eve told me that there were times as a woman that she did not feel comfortable, but she had to use her sort of street smarts, as she said, to get herself out of situations. Were there times where that affected you?
You're always aware of that. I think probably the place that I felt the least safe was when I was looking for the spotted dove in Los Angeles. And it just because you're driving around these streets, and I remember I'd stopped a couple of places and walked around. You got a camera, so I'm driving around looking, and I remember this person I passed several times, and as I'm passing at this red light, they came up and started opening my door, and I'm like, oh no. And I thought they must have thought that I was trying to buy something or sell something or something. But that we were so startled that, there were plenty of times that I saw bears. I wanted to go out and look for owls at night. I just saw a bear here earlier in the day. I actually saw a bear. I didn't feel so safe like going out by myself and looking in the dark looking for an owl. But fortunately, I found other people that happened to be doing the same thing, so I felt safer. But there's a lot of personal safety things that you have to just use your best judgment with, and you're desperate enough to look for an owl, you just go out and you do it anyway. I think, like I said, after going through this journey with my friend, and you just realize everybody's going to die, and this is living. You got to live, and you got to take chances. You can't just you're going to be very safe if you stay at home.
And what would you think is the best piece of advice you can give to someone who is contemplating a big year, whether it's ABA or just even a county big year or a state big year? What would you tell people who are on the fence or think that it's something they could never do? How would you advise them?
I just would tell them to follow their passion. If that's their passion, they're going to be so enriched by doing it. If just doing something for an entire year that you love, it's probably the most fulfilling thing you can possibly do. So I would encourage anyone to follow whatever passion that they have, and just live and make the most of every day and enjoy it, and look for the sunset. I just wanted to see as many sunsets as I could.
Mm-hmm.
I took pictures of every single butterfly and every whale. It's just, you just get so much out of birding, more than birding. You're
Mm-hmm.
looking, you got the environment, you got the animals and the everything around you, the flowers, and just embrace it and make the most of it and enjoy it.
And it's funny because I was so focused on the birds that I would get home and I'd be flipping through pictures to show Sue the bird, and then I flipped past a picture of a bear, and she said, "Wait, what's that?" And it was like I go back and it's a bear. It's a bear. You didn't tell me you saw bears. I get focused on things. I don't think that other people might want to see some of the other things I experienced besides the birds. We were in the Kenai Peninsula. I was with a guide, and he just says, "Get in the car." What? Get in the car. We're going in the car right now. It's okay. And so we get in the car, and he drives us out of the parking spot, and we just watch this huge bear, he called it a brownie, walking out of the woods and right across the road where we just were. And I learned when I was in the Northwest Territories that you don't go anywhere without your bear spray. And did you carry bear spray with you on those nights?
I did. Some of the time you can't fly with it.
It's an expensive thing that you have to leave behind. But I learned you leave it on the table in the hotel or in the lobby for the next person. Glad that I didn't have to use it.
Yeah, I was always within a place that was safe when I did see them.
Thank you so much. There's probably another hour of conversation we could have about the Pelee Warbler and the dry tortugas, but I really appreciate you taking the time to share with me that incredible adventure that you had and really talk about some of the more personal things that made doing a big year even more special for you.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to talk to you and being able to talk with birders who have done big years and share that with a wider audience. And just the idea that you can go out and just make a big list of something and travel to places you'd never been before. And that's the one thing for me, it was the places birding took me were as incredible as some of the birds I saw when I got there. I think it was Al Leventon who said sometimes birding is more about traveling to the birds than getting there. And the trips are some of the best things I've ever done.
Yeah.
Enjoy spring migration because you get it a little bit earlier there in Texas than we do.
Yeah.
Thank you again, and you take care. And I very much appreciate you joining me for the last hour.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
So after that, how can you not rush out and do a big year? I'm certainly inspired to do another one. Maybe it being May 1st, perhaps a big migration month. Anyway, thanks to Laura, who even 6 years after her big year is still in 4th place all time for the continental US and 7th, one behind Eve Morel. But it's not where you are in the standings or how many birds you've seen, but the places you've been and the birders you've met along the way that really add meaning to the lists we make on our big year journeys. I'm just saying that. I don't really believe it. You know, sometimes, it is the number of birds we count and the lists we make, sure. And I guess I'll just keep doing that. Here in Brantford, Ontario, the rain has stopped, the birds are out, and now it's my turn to get out there and begin the spring migration warbler count. Until next time, get out there, enjoy spring migration, unless you're listening to this in the throes of winter, in which case dream about next year's spring migration. And as always, may the migratory winds and the birds be with you. So long, take care, and hear me next time. I'm off to go birding.